call the honourable member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to rise and speak on this piece of legislation because it fits as part of a glorious package being put forward by the Turnbull government in dealing directly with the challenge of electricity prices in our Commonwealth. What we know is that for the past decade or so, there has been fundamental problems with how electricity and the energy market and energy policy has been approached. Under the previous government in particular, they started this rot, where you had policy approach from the basis of worrying about emissions cuts first, worrying about price second, and worrying ultimately about reliability last. And what's actually happened as a consequence of a bad fundamental approach to dealing with electricity and dealing with making sure there's sufficient energy provided to the market is unsurprising. When you worry about emissions cuts first, then you will get a policy framework that focuses on that. So introducing more and more unreliable power, which means that it compromises the stability of the grid, and then in addition to that, you just throw away any real concern about issues around prices. What this government is doing is reorientating the discussion around electricity where it belongs, mindful of, firstly, making sure the system's reliable so that people actually have power when they switch on the lights at home, to make sure that industry has access to the electricity they need to be able to generate the jobs to provide for Australians so that people can not just go out there in the workplace and work successfully, but actually earn an income so they can go home and pay their electricity bills at home as well. So reliability is critical. Secondly, we're very concerned about price and acknowledging and recognising that, firstly, people won't pay for electricity if they can't afford it. But more importantly, the price plays a very big role in making sure that all Australians can provide the energy they need. You know, my electorate, there are many people who might own a home. They might have bought it many, many years ago, and it may have a substantial value. So they may be asset well off. Some people are asset well off. But increasingly, pensioners and those on fixed incomes are forced to live in smaller parts of their home during winter because they can't afford their electricity bills. And we are mindful of this reality and making sure policy reflects their needs. And it always hits, higher electricity prices always hits the less well-off the most, and those who are on fixed incomes. And so it doesn't matter where you go in this great country, people are very mindful of their electricity bills and the human consequences when they go up. And that includes people, by the way, who sit in this House. It's no longer an issue that affects simply people based on their earning capacity or their income. Electricity prices have become a hot topic across the nation because people are facing real price pressure, and the Turnbull government is actually doing something about it. Now, getting that organisation of policy focused on reliability first, price second, and dealing with the environmental challenges is that when people can have a reliable system and they can actually afford their electricity, not unsurprisingly, they actually care about the environmental consequences and are happy to work with the government, with private investors to manage the change. But if you don't have that, you're not going to be able to get it because people are rightly going to return and focus on making sure they have reliable and affordable power first. And so this abolition of the limited merits review sits as part of that framework of acknowledging there's been about $6.5 billion that has been passed on to average Australians because of a bad policy framework that has led to contention around prices and flow-on costs for consumers. And that this simple measure taken by the Turnbull government, and let's be honest and acknowledge and thank those opposite and those on the crossbenches who are prepared to stand up and support the government's efforts to reduce prices on households, and thank them for it, that the leadership shown by the Turnbull government to actually deal with some of these challenges is real. It doesn't sit in isolation. We know the major investment in Snowy Hydro to increase its potential is part of the package as well. And there will be further measures that will continue to be rolled out, the intervention in the gas market, as a consequence directly of what the deals the previous government signed up, knowing full well that there were going to be consequences for domestic supply of gas and the price of gas. They are being tackled as well. And there will be further measures to be introduced over time to make sure that every lever that's available to the federal government, and many of them sit with the states, every lever available to the federal government to make sure that Australians can be able to afford their electricity bills in the coming years, in delivering reliable, affordable energy, while also dealing with some of the environmental consequences of energy production, will be addressed by this government. It's a position based in integrity and actually understanding the nature of the problem, rather than going off on grand, idiotic objectives and policy objectives set out by the more ideologically extreme parts of the opposition, as we've seen in previous governments. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't recognise very directly the challenges that are faced across Australia. I mean, I had this recently. I had some lovely constituents come and see me who raised with me concerns they had, for instance, about the environmental effects of stationary energy, in particular Dr Joan Corbett and Gillian King. And they came along and presented me with a petition from constituents of the concerns they had. And they're based, or their petition was principally signed out of St Peter's Church in Brighton, in Weir Street. And they raised particular concerns, to the honourable member and the speakers of the House of Representatives, that this petition of concern of the electorate of Goldstein draws to the attention of the House the severe and urgent threat that climate change poses to the health, well-being and security of all people around the world, particularly our poorest and most vulnerable neighbours. The petition goes on to say, we remind the House that Australia's greenhouse gas emissions are the highest per person among wealthy nations, while our emissions reduction targets are amongst the weakest. We therefore ask the House to do all in its power to protect communities in Australia and our region from the harmful impacts of climate change, such as more severe heat, extreme and unpredictable weather and rising seas, by committing to deeper and more urgent reductions of our greenhouse gas emissions, developing a plan to ensure Australians achieve zero net greenhouse gas emissions well before 2050, and supporting families and communities affected by the transition towards renewable energy and more sustainable land use, and providing additional assistance to help our poorest neighbours adapt to the harmful impacts of climate change. Now, this petition was signed by many people, and I'll be providing it to the Parliament for their consideration, for the Parliament's consideration. But when you sit down and talk to people like Gillian, like Dr Corbett, and have a mature dialogue about the important need to make sure that we have reliable power, exactly to protect the interests of the citizens that I've just spoken about, particularly those on fixed incomes or those less well off, they are mindful, aware of the situation. They're also mindful and aware of the fact that you need a reliable and stable grid. And so, for instance, the measures in the Finkel review are directly around making sure that there is battery storage for unreliable or non-consistent energy from renewable sources plays an important part in that discussion. And that's actually what happens when you have a mature and sensible discussion around the consequences of reliable energy, affordable energy, but also making sure we minimise our environmental footprint, is you can actually engage with people to take them on a journey and address the challenges that this country faces. But that's unfortunately not what we get from the opposition. Instead, we get sound bites, we get ideological posturing by the Leader of the Opposition and many of his acolytes on the opposition benches. And the consequences of that, the consequences of the path and the approach they take will only lead to higher prices, more unreliable energy, and increasingly there'll be a diminishing in anything they're going to do around emissions cuts as well. So you actually achieve nothing. That's why the Turnbull government approach is so rational and sensible and focuses directly on what we need to do as a nation to make sure that those who are concerned about the environment have their concerns addressed, but making sure we don't do and have an unnecessary and disproportionate harm on those who can least afford the consequences of bad Labor policy. But that's one of the great challenges we face, Deputy Speaker, in driving energy policy forward. Is there is a constant sovereign risk that sits over this over this policy in this country, and it is called the Australian Labor Party, in concert with their support of the Marxist member for Melbourne, who see no lesser opportunity to be able to nationalise parts of the electricity market. And we heard that from the Marxist member for Melbourne only a few minutes ago, where he wanted to be able to nationalise parts of the grid because he somehow has this delusion that if you just get bureaucrats in the room, that somehow they're always going to act in the best interests of the people. Now, the truth is, very clearly we've seen across human history that doesn't always work. And in fact, it actually often has the complete reverse effect. And if you want to see that, just look at the behaviour of the Queensland State Government, where they have near complete ownership of their energy generation assets. It's not leading to massive cheaper prices. In fact, the incentives are perversely in a different direction. What they actually do is try and find us new ways to be able to raise new revenue. By comparison, the great state of Victoria, which privatised assets many years ago and got a good price for them, and that was one of the great achievements of the Kennett government, at the same time has consistently had much lower prices than many other parts of the country where it's been driven by public ownership. So drawing such simple Marxist conclusions, as the member for Melbourne does a disservice to the communities that he's concerned about and does a disservice to the nation. But the other thing we need to be mindful of is not just to have a conversation with those people who are concerned about the rises in greenhouse gas emissions, though we should be mindful of that and we should work with them very successfully, and that's what this policy is doing. But it actually is addressing the very real challenges that industry face. Now, one of the things about the Goldstein electorate is we're actually quite industry-light, Deputy Speaker. There aren't many industrial parks. There's one significant one around part of Sandringham, but as soon as you leave the Goldstein electorate in parts of Moorabbin and Braeside and Dandenong, there is more industry. But just because there isn't a large amount of industry in the electorate, it is full of industrious people. People who sacrifice, take risks, invest in the future, not just for their own gain, but to employ many Australians and provide the jobs that this nation seeks and is the foundation of this great country. But I've got to say, Deputy Speaker, that I was disturbed recently when one of the businesses came and spoke to me about the reality they face when coming up to renegotiate their power prices and their power bills over the next few years. Now, there are lots of stories around this country, similar stories. I am not going to discount and say this is just isolated to businesses based in the southeast of Melbourne. But I wish the member for Isaacs, for instance, was here because a lot of those businesses operate out of his electorate, even if they are owned or operated by people within the Goldstein electorate. Because the consequences they face from bad policy at both a state level, but also the legacy effects of not approaching energy policy seriously has been by the previous government is quite real. In fact, this small business, I won't mention who they are, is a manufacturing company producing parts for things like vehicles and the like. And the situation they face when they've gone to market to ask about what their energy prices are going to be on wholesale contracts into the future is they have seen a dramatic increase over the next 3 years. And they've, the increases they've had estimated against all the competitive scenarios for electricity prices has ranged between about the high 200%, so 270, 280%, all the way up to the low 300%. And when you see over multi-years the potential for nearly 100% increase year on year, the consequences for job creation, for employment, for people to continue to be able to operate their business in a way that delivers human outcomes for the owners and for the employees is very real. And that's the situation that's being faced in the southeast of Melbourne right now. That's the situation being faced for many businesses that operate all across the country. Of course, we know the worst of it is being experienced by the great state of South Australia and the legacy of many years of bad Labor governments, and particularly their overinvestment in renewable power without any consideration or understanding of the consequences of the policy they have implemented. And it's true. We need to provide an environment of market certainty. We need to get more businesses to take capital and take risks and invest in the future building of this country. And that is at the heart of what this policy is seeking to achieve across by the Turnbull government. But there remains perpetually one big, fat risk in this country, and it is called the prospect in the future of a Labor government. That is the risk. And every time any Australian wants to look at why their electricity prices are going up and people say there is no investor certainty or confidence, it's because of the people who sit opposite. Because they will not get off their mad, idiotic, ideological approach to energy policy. Because they think, particularly under their super shifty leader, Bill Shorten, that they will sell out Australian households, Australian businesses and Australian jobs at any opportunity if they think they can appease votes, particularly in some parts of the electorates, like the Marxist member for Melbourne. And it's time we as a nation grew up. It's time we as a nation realised the real energy challenges we face and the only solutions are being provided on this side of the House by people like the member for Deakin, who's sitting at the front table right now, like the member for Kooyong, Josh Frydenberg, like the member for Wentworth and the Prime Minister, Josh Frydenberg. And it's being measured, sensible, proportionate, taking the country with us and making sure we deliver the outcomes that this country needs. So mocking by those opposite may make them feel better at the moment, but the legacy consequences will be felt by Australian households into the future. And that's why I'm proud to be part of this government, Deputy Speaker, is because we're focusing on what we need to do to lower the household electricity prices that every Australian faces, making sure we provide the investor framework and opportunity and certainty to make sure we can increase supply into the market, but more importantly to make sure that we're mindful of the human consequences of bad policy decision, anchored in reality, understanding the market and making sure we deliver for every Australian. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.